For decades, the Vrex Dominion mistook humanity's refusal to fight for submission. They annexed our colonies, mocked our silence, convinced we were a species too afraid to strike back. But the truth was far more terrifying. While they broadcast propaganda, we were listening, mapping every fracture in their culture of paranoia and cruelty. When they demanded our unconditional surrender, we didn't send fleets. We flooded their worlds with undiluted truth and unguarded compassion. And that empathy became the one weapon their shields could never deflect. This is the story of how humanity's greatest vulnerability became the most devastating offensive in galactic history. Over 2 centuries, the Vrex Dominion built an empire on fear and brute force, believing compassion was a fatal weakness. They were about to learn how catastrophically wrong they were. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the Vrex. They didn't just build an empire, they forged a machine. Every hatchling was given a rank before it could walk. At age 6 cycles, they were implanted with a loyalty monitor that tracked their thoughts. Dissent was not punished with prison. It was punished with public neural flaying, broadcast live across the Dominion as entertainment. The High Command, a council of 13 broodlords, had survived 500 years of constant purges, not because they were brilliant strategists, but because their paranoia made them preemptively crush every shadow of resistance. The Vrex weren't a society. They were a terror algorithm running on a loop. When they first brushed against human space, somewhere out near the Kepler drift, they cataloged us the way a predator catalogs a strange new animal. They watched our trade convoys, our diplomatic missions, our colonies filled with art and laughter. They saw no fortress worlds, no orbital cannons, no standing armies to speak of. To the Vrex, this was not enlightenment. It was evolutionary failure. A species that refused to dominate was a species waiting to be devoured. The first annexation happened on a Tuesday. A human agricultural colony called Meridian was broadcasting its weekly grain yield report when 3 Vrex dreadnoughts materialized in orbit. They didn't calm. They didn't demand. They simply landed occupation forces and declared the system Vrex territory. The colony governor, a woman named Priya Okonkwo, transmitted the highest priority diplomatic protest she could muster, and then she instructed her people to stand down. No resistance, no casualties. The Vrex High Command watched the footage and laughed. These creatures, they concluded, were broken. Over the next 17 years, the pattern repeated again and again. Trade routes seized, mining outposts occupied. An entire generation of human frontier settlers learned to smile, offer tea to armored alien soldiers, and quietly file diplomatic complaints that vanished into the black hole of Vrex bureaucracy. The Dominion's propaganda channels exploded with mockery. They called us the silent apes, a species too cowardly to defend its young. In the Galactic Assembly, the Vrex ambassador famously declared that humans were not predators, but cattle. The galaxy watched, and many believed it. But here is the thing they missed. Humanity was not silent. We were listening. Deep inside the Coalition Intelligence Bureau, a division known only as the cartographers had been mapping something no telescope could see. They dissected every Vrex propaganda broadcast, every intercepted internal memo, every drunk transmission between garrison commanders. They built psychological profiles of the broodlords, cultural models of Vrex society, and something else, a map of wounds. The Vrex Dominion, for all its battleships and bioweapons, was a dying beast held together by sutures of fear. The constant purges were not strength. They were proof that the Empire was terrified of its own shadow. The cartographers discovered that low-caste Vrex workers spent their lives in crushing despair, told that aliens were soulless vermin. They discovered that even mid-tier officers lived in constant fear of being reported for thought crimes. They found a brittle, fragile people who had never once been shown genuine kindness from outside their species. And then, on a cold February morning, the Vrex ultimatum arrived. Unconditional surrender within 72 hours, or Earth would be reduced to a glass beach. The Dominion fleet, the largest ever assembled in that quadrant, moved into position around the human homeworld. The galactic press wrote humanity's obituary. The High Command ordered extra rations and celebratory neural sessions. They thought victory was a formality. They didn't know that while they were polishing their dreadnoughts, human broadcast engineers were preparing the single most devastating transmission in galactic history. And what they were about to send into Vrex space was not a weapon of war. It was a mirror, and the Vrex had never once looked in one. At 0000 on the day the Dominion's ultimatum expired, Project Mirror went live. Human engineers didn't fire a single missile. They targeted the one infrastructure the Vrex had never bothered to defend, their own propaganda broadcast array. Across 300 occupied systems, every household display, every garrison terminal, and every neural compliance monitor flickered once, and then the face of the Broodlord delivering his victory address was replaced by something the Dominion had never seen. A human child laughing as her father pushed her on a swing, a grandmother teaching her grandchild to bake bread, a group of friends singing off-key around a campfire. No combat footage, no demands, just life. The cartographers had spent 17 years building the most dangerous archive in history. They knew that Vrex society was held together by a single brittle thread, the lie that aliens were soulless vermin. So they didn't argue, they didn't debate, they simply showed the truth. Thousands of hours of human existence flooded Vrex space on every frequency they could reach. Families holding each other during bad news, artists painting sunsets, doctors weeping after losing a patient. Humans being utterly, irreducibly human. But the broadcasts weren't just passive footage. The cartographers had also intercepted 17 years of internal Vrex communications. They knew the names of individual soldiers. They knew which garrison commanders secretly feared their own loyalty monitors. And with agonizing precision, they began inserting targeted messages. A low-caste maintenance worker on the dreadnought Asterisk Eternal Victory received a file labeled simply, "Your daughter." He opened it to find a photo of his own child, taken from a human surveillance drone outside his housing block, alongside a note that read, "She deserves to know the truth about what you're being ordered to do." His neural monitor spiked in confusion, but no one was watching. The compliance center was already overwhelmed with a flood of identical alerts. Within 48 hours, the first anonymous subspace line opened. It was a frequency the humans had seeded into the Vrex civilian network, masked as a maintenance channel. The voice on the other end whispered in broken human trade language, "Is this real?" A volunteer counselor, trained for exactly this moment, answered, "Yes. What do you want to know?" The Vrex on the other end didn't ask about military secrets. He asked why the humans in the videos didn't look afraid. He asked if the color blue really looked like that, or if it was a trick of the broadcast. He asked if the things his broodlord had told him about alien parasites were lies. The counselor answered every question with gentle patience. And then, before disconnecting, the Vrex said something that made the cartographer's analysts stop breathing. "I don't want to die in this war. I never chose it." The High Command reacted exactly as the human analysts predicted, with brute force. They declared the transmissions a psyop virus, a weaponized neurological attack. They ordered every receiving unit smashed. They threatened death by neural flaying for any citizen caught watching. But the humans had anticipated that too. Every time a garrison commander issued the destruction order, a new batch of cheap relay drones, smaller than a human fist, self-deployed from cargo containers already floating in Vrex space. The broadcasts continued, and something worse happened. The soldiers ordered to destroy the terminals began hesitating, not because they were insubordinate, because they had already watched. They had seen a human father weeping at his son's grave, and it looked exactly like the way a Vrex father wept. The lie was cracking, but the real pivot came from inside the Dominion's most trusted killing machine. Commander Zaltoric, the Broodlord's own nephew and commandant of the dreadnought Unyielding Fury Asterisk, was assigned to trace the source of the transmissions and silence it permanently. He was the perfect weapon, genetically engineered for aggression, his loyalty rating a flawless 100%. He began his investigation by isolating a captured relay drone and dissecting its data core. What he found was not combat footage. It was a single file, tagged with his own military identification code. He opened it. Inside was a recording of a human woman reading a children's story to her daughter. And then, at the end, she looked directly into the camera and said his name. Zaltorek, your mother's execution order was signed by your uncle 40 years ago. Here is the proof. Attached were unredacted Dominion records, showing that his mother had not died in an industrial accident as he had been told, but had been convicted of sedition for asking for better rations. Zaltorek read the document 17 times, his neural monitor screaming warnings that went unheeded because no one in command dared look at his screen. When he finally stood up, he walked to his personal quarters and did something no Vrex officer had ever done. He opened a private channel to the human broadcast hub. "I need to understand," he said. "Tell me how to stop hatting." What happened next moved faster than the Dominion could comprehend. Zaltorek didn't defect publicly. He did something far more insidious. He began showing the human broadcasts to his bridge crew, one officer, then 2, then 20. Within a week, the crew of the unyielding Fury Asterisk, the pride of the Vrex Armada, had entirely ceased combat drills. They were watching, talking, arguing among themselves about the nature of their own empire. And when a subordinate officer reported the contamination to high command, Zaltorek personally confronted the snitch in the corridor. The security footage showed no plasma fire. Zaltorek simply put his hand on the officer's shoulder and said, "Brother, you have been lied to. Would you like to see what I have seen?" The officer, conditioned for violence, stood frozen. And then he nodded. The high command, panicking, decided that this infection required surgical removal. They ordered the immediate neural flaying of Zaltorek's entire crew as an example to the fleet. The execution order reached the Asterisk unyielding Fury at dawn. But when the enforcer squad marched onto the bridge, they found the crew waiting, unarmed, standing in rows, looking at them with something that the enforcer captain had never seen before. Not defiance, pity. "We will not resist," Zaltorek said calmly. "But before you kill us, watch this, all of it." He gestured to the main display where a human documentary about forgiveness was playing. The enforcer captain raised his weapon, and then he lowered it. One of his own soldiers, a young grunt named Krell, stepped forward and removed his helmet. "Sir," Krell whispered, "I think we've been wrong." That was the moment the Vrex war machine stopped being a machine and became a fractured conversation. Across the fleet, word spread not of a military mutiny, but of a spiritual awakening. Soldiers who had never questioned their orders began asking their commanders why they were fighting. Garrisons on occupied worlds reported entire battalions refusing to patrol. On the homeworld, the lowest caste workers, the ones who had been shown nothing but contempt their entire lives, began gathering in public squares to talk about the broadcasts. The high command, isolated and terrified, convened an emergency session that lasted 3 days. They emerged with a single desperate conclusion. If the infection could not be stopped, the infected must be burned away. They issued the order for total scorched earth purge of every unit exposed to human transmissions. 6 million Vrex soldiers and civilians marked for execution by their own government. And as the execution fleets powered up their weapons and turned their guns inward, the broodlords did not realize the final, fatal truth. The admirals they had tasked with delivering death had, every single one of them, already seen the mirror. And none of them were certain anymore which side of it they were on. The execution fleets powered up their weapons systems, targeting solutions locked onto 6 million souls. And then the lead admiral, a veteran named Kothvarak who had conquered 17 systems, opened a channel to the entire armada. His voice, broadcast on the secure command frequency, spoke 2 words that shattered 1,000 years of Dominion doctrine. "Stand down." The purge order, for the first time in Vrex history, was refused. Kothvarak had spent the previous 3 nights watching human families grieve, human strangers forgive each other, human artists capture moments of profound tenderness on canvas. He couldn't unsee it, and neither could the 48 shipmasters under his command. Across the fleet, weapons arrays went dark. The broodlords, watching from their fortified citadel, screamed for immediate neural flaying of the entire admiralty. But the enforcers tasked with delivering that punishment were the same soldiers who had already begun questioning everything. The machinery of terror had eaten itself. Then the humans did something that genuinely terrified the High Command more than any mutiny. They did nothing. No fleet movements, no threats, no triumphant broadcasts. They simply continued streaming. More hours of human life, more counseling channels, more gentle conversations between trained volunteers and terrified Vreks who had never spoken to an alien without a weapon in their claws. The silence from Earth was more devastating than any bombardment because it proved the humans had never wanted destruction. They wanted connection. That was the horror the broodlords could not compute. But the cracks weren't confined to the military. On a dozen occupied worlds, labor caste Vreks, the invisible underclass who maintained the Empire's factories and farms, began disappearing from their workstations. At first, overseers assumed they were fleeing punishment. Then surveillance feeds showed them gathering in tunnels and hangars, not to plot violence, but to discuss what they had seen. They passed around data chips with human poetry, human philosophy, recordings of human diplomats speaking calmly about reconciliation. They began asking questions that had no answers in Dominion doctrine. What if the aliens were not monsters? What if our own leaders were the ones who lied? And from those tunnels, a word began spreading in the Vrex language that had no equivalent in their culture: hope. And then came the moment the galaxy truly realized the game had changed. A Vrex broadcast technician, a lowly worker named Telrith, managed to hijack the Dominion's primary propaganda feed for 43 seconds. In that window, instead of the usual image of the Broodlord, he broadcast a single silent image, the famous human photograph from their ancient history, the Earthrise over the moon, with text in Vrex script underneath. It read, "We are not your enemy, we are your neighbors." Telrith was executed within minutes, but the image had already been captured by trillions of receivers, and it didn't just affect the Vrex. Across the galaxy, dozens of neutral species who had watched humanity's patience with disdain suddenly began to understand. The Dominion's invincibility was a myth, and myths, once broken, never fully recover. The High Command, now facing disintegration, made one final catastrophic decision. They would invade Earth directly, not with orbital bombardment they feared that would unify the galaxy against them. Instead, they would deploy ground forces to seize the human broadcast hubs and execute the cartographers publicly. A surgical strike to cauterize the infection. They reassigned the few loyalist divisions they could trust and launched a covert insertion toward the Sol system. But here is the part the Broodlords never anticipated. Their own intelligence officers had been letting human scouts slip past their perimeter for months. The cartographers had built relationships with mid-level Vrex analysts who believed, in their secret hearts, that the Empire was wrong. Those analysts sent the invasion plans directly to Earth 48 hours before the fleet departed. The humans knew exactly when and where the attack would land. What the Vrex found when they entered the Sol system was not a hostile fleet. It was an open channel. And on that channel, a single human woman, the same grandmother who had been baking bread in the first broadcasts, was waiting. She spoke directly to the invasion force commander, a hardened general named Draxkull. "General," she said, "I made more bread than I need. Would you and your soldiers like some? You must be hungry after the journey." The bridge of his warship fell silent. Draxkull stared at the screen. His neural monitor flatlined, unable to categorize this as a threat or a trap. Because it was neither. It was an invitation. He later admitted that he almost accepted. Instead, he ordered the fleet to hold position and asked for time to think. Time was all the humans ever needed. As the invasion stalled, the Dominion's collapse accelerated beyond any simulation. On the homeworld, a coalition of low-caste workers and disillusioned officers formed a provisional council. They issued a statement that sent shockwaves across known space. The High Command had lost the mandate to rule. They demanded an immediate ceasefire and requested human mediators for the transition. The Broodlords, barricaded in their fortress, discovered that their personal guard had dismantled the door locks. They were not under arrest. They were invited to walk outside and speak with their own people for the first time in their lives without intermediaries. The galactic press captured the moment. A thousand-year tyrant, trembling, stepped into the light and faced the subjects he had terrorized. And what he saw broke him. Not rage, just weary, hopeful faces asking him to finally stop lying. The human ambassador, a woman named Myra Okonkwo, daughter of the governor of the first annexed colony, arrived on the Vrek's homeworld unarmed. She walked through streets that had never seen a human without chains, and she offered not terms of surrender, but terms of friendship. She carried a single data drive containing 17 years of intercepted Vrek's internal communications, proof of every crime, every lie. But she also carried something else, 17 years of personal letters written by human volunteers to imaginary Vrek's pen pals, waiting for the day someone would read them. She distributed them to the crowd. "We've been trying to talk to you for a long time," she said. "We never wanted to fight you. We wanted to know you." That was the day the Vrek's dominion officially ceased to exist. Not conquered, not bombed, not humiliated, chosen out of existence by its own people who finally saw a better way. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy held its breath. Historians would later call it the quiet unraveling. Without a single shot fired in anger, the Vrek's dominion, a regime that had stood for half a millennium, simply dissolved. Provisional councils formed on every occupied world. Former garrison commanders, the same ones who once mocked human weakness, now requested human cultural attaches to help them understand the broadcasts that had transformed their soldiers. The cartographers, who had spent 17 years in classified obscurity, were suddenly the most sought-after advisors in known space. But they refused every medal, every title, every public appearance. Their work, they insisted, was never about victory. It was about honesty. Myra Okonkwo became the face of the new era. She had been 14 years old when her mother, Governor Priya Okonkwo, told her to stand down as Vrek's dreadnoughts filled the skies above Meridian. That lesson, that patience was not surrender, had shaped her entire life. Now, standing in the charred ruins of the High Command Citadel, she addressed not just the Vreks but the hundreds of alien species watching via subspace relay. She did not speak of conquest. She spoke of gardens. Of the human tradition of planting trees whose shade you would never sit under. The Vreks had no word for that concept. By the end of her speech, a committee of Vreks linguists was already working to create one. The reintegration was not seamless. There were loyalist holdouts, deep space redoubts where the old ways festered. There were human hardliners who argued that mercy was weakness and that the Dominion should have been annihilated. But something extraordinary happened. The Vreks themselves, ordinary workers, former soldiers, the newly empowered low castes, took the lead in rooting out the remnants of the old regime. They had been the Empire's victims for centuries, but they refused to become executioners. They had watched humanity forgive, and they wanted to learn how. Zaltoric, the commander whose awakening had started it all, requested to meet the human woman who had recorded the children's story with his name. Her name was Esther, a retired librarian from the outskirts of Lagos. She had volunteered for the cartographer's pen pal program in the earliest days, writing letters to an imaginary Vrek's recipient, never knowing if anyone would ever read them. When Zaltoric finally met her via holocall, he spoke through a translator, his voice unsteady. "I never knew my mother," he said, "but when I heard your voice, I understood what I had lost." Esther, tears on her cheeks, simply replied, "I'm glad you're here now." That exchange, recorded accidentally by a still-active surveillance drone, became the most-watched media clip in the galaxy for 17 straight cycles. But the final surprising detail, the one that historians now teach in every academy, is that the weapon of empathy was never actually deployed by humanity. It was already buried inside the Vreks. The cartographers' greatest insight was not that truth could break a dictatorship, but that the Vreks were already broken by their own lies. The neural compliance monitors, designed to detect seditious thoughts, had spent generations cataloging the private despair of an entire species. Every flicker of doubt, every suppressed question, every silent scream was logged in the Dominion's vast surveillance archives. When humanity began broadcasting unvarnished truth, those archives became the fuse. The monitors couldn't stop recording, and when Vrex citizens saw other Vrex, not aliens, but their own people, admitting to doubt, it validated the thoughts they had been taught to fear. The empire fell not from outside pressure, but from the internal release of generational cognitive dissonance. Empathy was just the key that unlocked the door the Vrex had been pressing against for centuries. General Kothvarak, the admiral who had refused the purge order, summarized it best in his memoirs. "We thought the humans were too weak to fight. We were wrong. They were too strong to need to fight. They understood that the most terrifying thing you can do to an enemy is not to destroy them. It is to show them who they truly are." In the treaty signing ceremony, televised across 1,000 worlds, the former broodlord, a shell of the tyrant he had been, asked Myra Okonkwo a question. "Why?" he whispered. "Why didn't you just kill us all when you had the chance?" She looked at him with an expression that held no anger, only a quiet, profound sadness. "Because," she said, "that's not who we are." The reinvention of the Vrex Dominion into the Vrex Human Coalition became the template for a new kind of galactic coexistence. It wasn't perfect. It never is. But it proved something that every military strategist had missed, that the deepest vulnerability of any system built on cruelty is the truth that cruelty is unnatural. It must be constantly reinforced, constantly justified, constantly fed. And once you starve it of those lies, it withers on its own. The galaxy learned that day that humanity's patience had never been fear. It had been the confidence of a species willing to wait 17 years for its moment, not to strike, but to speak. And when the time came, they didn't launch missiles. They started a conversation. The mightiest war machine in the sector crumbled, not under fire, but under the unbearable weight of being seen. So where does that leave us? The Vrex Dominion, a seemingly unstoppable empire, fell not to a superior weapon, but to an unflinching commitment to connection. This isn't just a story about one civilization's collapse. It's a mirror for every conflict we face today. At its core, the question remains: what if the strategies we dismiss as weakness are simply forms of strength we've been conditioned not to recognize? The galaxy learned that patience doesn't mean passivity. Sometimes it means waiting until your adversary is so tangled in their own lies that a single thread of truth can unravel everything. Humanity's empathy wasn't some magical cure. It was a calculated act of resistance, a refusal to accept that violence is the only language power understands. And it worked because the Vrex were never the monsters they pretended to be. They were frightened, isolated beings trapped in a system that outlawed their own hearts. The humans simply showed them that they were not alone. If this story resonated with you, it's because we all know what it's like to be misunderstood, to have our patience mistaken for fear. The next time someone mistakes your silence for weakness, remember the Vrex Dominion. Remember that the most profound revolutions rarely start with a bang. They start with a conversation. If you believe in the power of stories like this to reshape how we see the universe, then hit that like button and subscribe. Help us prove that empathy is far from extinction. Thank you for watching, and until next time, never stop asking what might happen if we chose to understand before we strike.